It was April 1945. The air over Germany was still and gray, heavy with the smell of burning wood and diesel. In the ruins of a small Rhineland village somewhere between the Rhine and the Weser, women swept glass from broken windows. Children searched for bread crusts in the gutters, and old men stared down the empty road leading east. The Wehrmacht was supposed to come. That's what the radio had promised. Reinforcements, the counterattack, the miracle weapons that would drive the invaders back. So they waited. They waited through nights when artillery echoed in the distance, when the church bells rang not for mass, but for warning. The horizon flashed with the faint pulse of war, orange glows over hills that once looked peaceful. Then one morning, around 10, they heard engines, low, rhythmic, confident. Children ran to the street, calling for their fathers in uniform. Mothers straightened themselves, ready to salute, but as the sound grew closer, the flags they carried began to lower, because the vehicles rounding the corner weren't German trucks. They were olive-green jeeps, with white stars on their hoods and soldiers who spoke a language no one there understood. The Wehrmacht never came. And for the first time, the people of that small town realized the war, their war, was truly over. Germany, early 1945. The collapse begins by the dawn of 1945. The Third Reich was dying, though its leaders refused to admit it. The front lines that once stretched proudly from the Atlantic to the Volga had disintegrated into a shrinking ring around a shattered nation. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military machine in Europe, was bleeding out on two fronts. In the east, the Red Army had burst through Poland and was advancing relentlessly toward Berlin. In the west, the Allied armies, American, British, Canadian, and French, had crossed the Rhine and were spreading across Germany's industrial heartland. For the German people, this was not merely defeat. It was disorientation. Propaganda still filled the airwaves. Even as cities lay in ruins, Goebbels's broadcasts spoke of inevitable victory and new weapons that would change the war's course. The Volkssturm, a desperate militia of boys and old men, was being conscripted to defend towns long since abandoned by the regular army. In homes across the Reich, families clung to these illusions. They wrote letters to sons who would never answer, whispered prayers that Hitler's armies were regrouping somewhere beyond the horizon. But the reality on the ground was stark. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Allied bombers ruled the skies, turning railways, bridges, and factories into smoking wrecks. By March, General George S. Patton's Third Army and General Courtney Hodges' First Army were advancing through western Germany faster than any intelligence report could track. The famed Rhine River, once declared an impenetrable barrier, had been crossed. In the small towns of Bavaria, Thuringia, and the Rhineland, civilians awoke to find that the front no longer existed. There was no clear battle line anymore. One day the SS passed through, the next nothing. Then, without warning, American tanks appeared on the same roads. The Wehrmacht's retreat had become a collapse. Chaotic, leaderless, irreversible. And yet, across much of Germany, civilians waited. They believed that somehow the army would return, that the gray uniforms of the Wehrmacht would roll back in triumph, restoring order, dignity, and the old world they remembered. They didn't know that those soldiers were either dead, captured, or scattered in the forests, trying to surrender before the Soviets arrived. In places like Kassel, Fulda, and the Saar, people still painted swastikas on barns and placed portraits of Hitler in their windows, hoping to show loyalty. Perhaps it might spare them when the army came back. But the only thing that came was the low growl of American engines, echoing across cobblestone streets and empty market squares. For many Germans, that sound was the end of a lie, the final note of a symphony that had begun 12 years earlier, with marching bands and torchlight parades. The dream of the 1,000-year Reich was over. What replaced it was confusion, fear, and the quiet realization that everything they had believed was collapsing before their eyes. And as American forces advanced deeper, their progress revealed not just military conquest, but the human cost of a war Germany had unleashed, the Western Front. When the war came home by March 1945, the rhythm of war had changed. The thunder of Allied artillery was no longer a distant echo. It was at the edge of every town, every forest, every farmhouse. The U.S. 1st and 9th Armies had broken through the Siegfried Line, Germany's last great defensive wall, and were moving east at a speed no one thought possible. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group commanded more than 1 million men pushing through the Rhineland. They came not as raiders, but as an organized flood, deliberate, unstoppable, and astonishingly fast. German resistance was collapsing in pockets. Some SS units still fought with suicidal resolve. Others melted away under artillery fire. The Volkssturm fought from basements, from barns, from church towers, often without ammunition or command. In the ruins of towns like Cologne, Aachen, and Remagen, the war looked less like a front and more like a tide, sweeping away what was left of Hitler's Reich. And as the tide rose, the civilians waited. Many had been told that the Americans would destroy everything, that they were barbarians, killers, and thieves. The Nazi propaganda ministry had filled the last remaining newspapers with grotesque caricatures of Allied soldiers. Posters warned of the terror from the West, but the people were too exhausted to believe or disbelieve anymore. They had seen too much. Bombers had turned their cities to dust. Their sons had not returned from the East, and now their own leaders were vanishing. In many towns, mayors hung white sheets from windows, hoping to signal surrender before the fighting reached them. In others, the SS executed anyone who tried. The Reich was devouring itself. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced with a precision that seemed unreal. Their M4 Shermans and M3 half-tracks moved along the same roads where retreating Germans had left wreckage and corpses. Alongside them came the small, nimble Willys MB jeeps, open-topped, fast and everywhere. To German eyes, they seemed strange, exposed machines carrying men who smiled, smoked, and talked as if they were tourists rather than conquerors. But behind those smiles was an army that had mastered mobility, supply and communication like no other. In towns like Koblenz, Trier, and Würzburg, American engineers repaired bridges almost as quickly as they were destroyed. Radio operators kept divisions connected across hundreds of kilometers. For the first time in modern warfare, speed was no longer chaos. It was control. And as German families peered out from behind curtains, they began to see the war not as a distant newsreel but as a reality rolling down their own streets, in the form of jeeps, tanks, and men wearing helmets marked with white stars. The Wehrmacht had promised protection. The Reich had promised glory. But what arrived instead was the quiet hum of American engines, the scent of gasoline and canvas, and a future no one could yet understand. The end of the war wasn't coming from Berlin. It was arriving one small town at a time, and in those towns, the world's greatest army met the people it had come to defeat, and perhaps to free the human angle. Waiting in the ruins, by April 1945, waiting had become a way of life. For the people of Germany, time itself seemed to have slowed, every day blending into the next, filled with the same dull rituals of survival. They listened for aircraft first thing each morning. They looked for distant columns of smoke by noon, and when night fell, they whispered by candlelight about which towns had fallen, which sons were still alive, and which roads were now impassable. The fear was not of defeat. Defeat was already certain. The fear was of how it would arrive. For 12 years they had been told they were the chosen nation, superior, protected, destined to rule. Yet the reality outside their doors was rubble and silence. When American troops finally appeared, it was not in a storm of vengeance, but with an unnerving calm. Children, who had been raised saluting the swastika, stared at soldiers who offered them chocolate. Women who had been warned to fear monsters saw men who shared rations and cigarettes instead. Some wept. Others simply watched in disbelief. It wasn't kindness that shocked them most. It was normalcy. The casual ease with which these foreign men occupied their streets, confident yet unthreatening, revealed something devastating. Germany was no longer the center of the world. It was simply another defeated country, and these soldiers were now its reality. That realization, quiet, personal, unspoken, was more powerful than any surrender document. The tactical angle, the machinery of momentum from a tactical standpoint. The final months of the war were a masterclass in operational mobility. While the Wehrmacht's divisions fractured into isolated remnants, The U.S. Army moved as a coherent machine. Entire course advanced dozens of kilometers per day, coordinated by a network of radio, logistics, and reconnaissance units. At the heart of this system was the Jeep, a small, unarmored vehicle that redefined how war was fought. It served as command post, ambulance, messenger, and scout car all at once. With its ability to move fast across any terrain, the Jeep gave commanders eyes and ears everywhere. In contrast, the German forces were crippled by shortages of fuel, spare parts, even horses. Tanks were abandoned for lack of petrol. Communications broke down. What had once been a precise war machine was now a scattered collection of desperate defenses. American speed created confusion. Entire German regiments woke to find themselves bypassed, isolated in towns no longer part of the front. By the time they realized what had happened, they were surrounded. This was the genius of Allied momentum, not brute force, but the relentless exploitation of collapse. To the soldiers in those olive-green vehicles, it was a mission. To the civilians who watched them roll past, it was the visible proof that their army was gone. Every Jeep that entered a German village was a symbol, not just of military power, but of inevitability. The psychological angle, the death of faith for years. The German public had lived within an engineered illusion. The Nazi state had controlled every word, every broadcast, every image. Even when Allied bombers darkened the skies, Goebbels' propaganda insisted it was a temporary setback. But when the Americans arrived, there was no denying the truth. The collapse of faith was immediate and brutal. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was the disintegration of an entire belief system. Many civilians experienced a kind of numbness. They didn't resist. They simply stopped believing in anything at all. Priests tried to console them, but even the churches lay in ruins. Teachers who once lectured about Aryan destiny now whispered prayers that the occupation would be merciful. In a few places, fanatics fought on. SS patrols executed anyone attempting surrender. But for the vast majority, the will to fight had evaporated. When the olive jeeps appeared, it was as though the horizon itself had changed color. The banners, the songs, the grand promises, all turned to silence. What replaced them was not chaos, but a strange calm. The quiet shock of a nation realizing that its future would now be written by others. And yet, amid that shock, something else was stirring, a sense of reluctant relief. Because for many, the end of Nazi Germany also meant the end of fear. The technological angle, the Jeep and the machine that won the war, in the chaos of 1945, few symbols captured the contrast between the collapsing Reich and the advancing Allies as perfectly as the Jeep. It wasn't imposing like a tank, nor thunderous like an artillery gun. Yet it was everywhere, small, agile, and unstoppable. The Willys MB, designed in 1940, had evolved from a simple reconnaissance vehicle into the beating heart of Allied mobility. Wherever the Americans went, the Jeep led the way. It carried officers, medics, radiomen, and prisoners. It scouted roads, forded rivers, and climbed hills where even trucks stalled. Its engine growl became the soundtrack of liberation, and for German civilians, the sound that marked the end. The Wehrmacht, once proud of its engineering, watched as these light, unarmored vehicles outmaneuvered entire divisions bogged down by complexity. The German army had relied on precision craftsmanship, Tiger tanks, half-tracks, and intricate supply chains. But in total war, simplicity triumphed. The Jeep required little maintenance, could be repaired with basic tools, and ran on the same gasoline used by trucks and tanks. In the final months, that flexibility proved decisive. A single Jeep could connect a frontline officer with headquarters, deliver rations, or evacuate the wounded, tasks that had once demanded entire convoys. The contrast was profound. Germany's military genius had created machines of terror. America's had created machines of movement. When those small vehicles rolled into German villages, they didn't just bring soldiers, they brought proof of an industrial power and logistical intelligence that had already reshaped the modern world. The war's outcome wasn't decided solely by courage or tactics. It was decided by engineering that could endure. Leadership in 1945 Germany was a study in contrasts. On one side stood the Allied commanders, Patton, Hodges, Bradley, Eisenhower, orchestrating an advance that stretched from the North Sea to the Alps. Their strength lay in delegation and adaptability. Each division knew its role, each unit trusted the next. Their DT command structure was flexible enough to seize opportunity, yet disciplined enough to sustain order. On the other side was Hitler's Germany, paralyzed by delusion. From his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler issued impossible orders to divisions that no longer existed. He forbade retreats, demanded counterattacks, and dismissed generals who spoke of reality. Communication between front and Führer was no longer strategy. It was fantasy. In the field, even capable officers could do little. Field Marshal Model, known as the Führer's fireman, struggled to maintain cohesion among broken armies in the Ruhr pocket. When encircled by the Americans, he refused surrender and took his own life. This failure of leadership extended downward. Civilian administrators fled their posts. Local officials, once proud enforcers of Nazi rule, now hid their uniforms and burned party documents. In stark contrast, American units displayed remarkable composure. When they entered towns, they did not loot or destroy. Military police managed civilians, engineers restored bridges, and supply units arrived within hours. To the Germans, this discipline was almost incomprehensible. The invaders seemed not driven by hatred but by procedure, efficient, orderly, and indifferent to revenge. That calm precision was itself a kind of power. It showed that the war had shifted beyond emotion into structure, a structured inevitability that no act of fanaticism could resist. In war, morality often collapses with the armies. But when American troops entered Germany, something remarkable happened. Restraint. These soldiers had seen the horrors of the Western Front, the concentration camps, the ruins of France, the bodies of comrades killed in ambushes. They had every reason to hate. Yet for the most part, they did not act with vengeance. When the first American columns reached German towns, they did not burn or massacre. Instead, they demanded order. Weapons were confiscated, curfews imposed, white flags required on every house. Civilians were treated not as enemies, but as subjects of a defeated state. The soldiers offered food to children, medical aid to the wounded, and sometimes shared cigarettes with men who had been enemies only hours before. This moral restraint shocked many Germans. They had been told to expect atrocities, the kind that their own armies had committed across Europe. Instead, they encountered discipline, mercy, and bureaucracy. That contrast became a silent mirror. The people began to understand without words the scale of their deception. Of course, there were exceptions, moments of cruelty, theft, and anger. War never ends cleanly. But in the larger arc, the American occupation revealed a truth that propaganda had hidden, that power could be both firm and humane. The sight of jeeps on cobblestone streets symbolized not just defeat, but the beginning of moral reckoning. For the first time, Germans saw what rule without terror looked like, and that realization, quiet, unspoken, deeply human, marked the true beginning of post-war Germany. April 1945. The moment the Reich fell silent. The war in Western Germany did not end with a single explosion or a grand declaration. It ended in whispers, white flags, and the sound of jeep engines echoing through empty streets. By early April, the U.S. Ninth Army had completed its encirclement of the Ruhr pocket, trapping over 300,000 German troops, the last coherent force of the Western Wehrmacht. Inside that shrinking perimeter, hunger and hopelessness spread faster than any bullet. Commanders begged for fuel, for orders, for air cover. Berlin gave none. When the Americans closed in, entire German divisions disintegrated overnight. Young recruits surrendered en masse, terrified not of death but of being sent east to the Soviets. For them, captivity under the Americans was salvation. The Ruhr, once the industrial heart of Hitler's empire, became a silent graveyard of machines. Steelworks lay cold, tanks rusted in the rain. The same factories that had fed the Blitzkrieg now stood powerless before the relentless advance of the enemy they had once mocked. For the civilians, the experience was surreal. In towns like Essen, Hagen, and Iserlohn, the first sight of American troops came not with bombing but with order. Jeeps appeared first, usually 2 or 3, moving cautiously down the main street. Machine guns swiveled left and right, scanning the rooftops. Then came the command cars. And finally, the endless convoys of infantry, medics, and supply trucks everywhere they went. They found the same scene. Streets deserted, windows shuttered. White sheets fluttering in the wind. In some towns, German soldiers had already fled. In others, local mayors met the Americans and formally surrendered the keys to the city. In a few tragic cases, SS holdouts tried to fight, but they were crushed within hours, often by artillery fire so precise it seemed surgical. And then, just as quickly as the shooting began, it ended. A town would fall silent. The Americans would take positions, post sentries, and begin distributing orders. Civilians emerged hesitantly, pale, trembling, clutching children. The fear was palpable, but what followed was something unexpected. Instead of looting or violence, there was method. American officers marked intersections, MPs established checkpoints, and translators explained curfews in broken German. Within hours, the chaos of battle turned into the rhythm of occupation. For many Germans, this was their first real encounter with the outside world in years. They heard radios broadcasting in English, saw soldiers laughing freely, and realized how small their own world had become. The propaganda that had once painted the Allies as monsters now looked absurd beside the quiet professionalism of these men in foreign uniforms. And yet, amid this calm, there was also humiliation, the raw pain of seeing one's homeland controlled by outsiders. Proud families lowered their eyes as American flags were hoisted over town halls where swastikas had flown only days earlier. The Reich had not just been defeated, it had been replaced. Across the horizon, the pattern repeated, one town after another, one surrender after another. The German map was folding in on itself. The cities that had once launched invasions now became coordinates for their own occupation. From Kassel to Magdeburg, Fulda to Leipzig, the story was the same. The end of a world told not through speeches or orders, but through the sound of foreign wheels rolling over German soil. The day the truth arrived, by mid-April 1945, Germany was no longer a battlefield, it was an open wound. Every road, every village, every face carried the scars of a war that had consumed the nation from within. The Americans pressed forward with mechanical precision. Their next targets were the Elbe River and the towns that guarded it, Magdeburg, Dessau, and Torgau. Behind them, the Ruhr pocket had collapsed entirely. 325,000 German soldiers laid down their arms, the largest single surrender of the Western Front. But even as one campaign ended, another began, the uncovering of truth. Near towns like Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, and Dachau, American patrols stumbled upon scenes no one had expected: camps, fences, bodies. The first to enter were often Jeep Scouts. The same vehicles that had been symbols of conquest now became witnesses to atrocity. Soldiers who had fought through France and Belgium stood frozen, staring at emaciated figures in striped rags, the stench of death thick in the air. Many of them had doubted the rumors of German camps, but now there was no denying what they saw. The war they thought they understood, one of fronts, tanks, and tactics, had been something else entirely. It had been genocide hidden behind discipline, murder disguised as patriotism. For the German civilians nearby, the revelation was equally shattering. When American units forced them to walk through the camps, they saw what their government had built in their name. Some wept, others stared blankly, unable to comprehend. A few denied it still. But their silence spoke louder than denial. In those days, something profound changed between conqueror and conquered. The Americans no longer saw the Germans merely as enemies. They saw them as a people lost in a nightmare of their own creation. And the Germans, stripped of illusion, began to see the Americans not as invaders, but as the first bearers of reality. The sound of the Jeep, once the herald of defeat, became the signal of discovery. Wherever it rolled, it carried news that the war's lies were unraveling. In town squares and factories, German citizens were ordered to remove Nazi banners and replace them with white cloths. Propaganda posters were torn down. Loudspeakers broadcast Allied announcements. For the first time in over a decade, the voice of the Reich was silent. Meanwhile, deep within Berlin, Hitler raged in his bunker, issuing orders to phantom divisions, moving pins on maps that no longer represented anything. To his generals, the war was already over. To him, it was unthinkable. But outside those bunker walls, History had already chosen its path. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River. The meeting, immortalized in photographs, symbolized the total encirclement of Nazi Germany. From east and west, the Allied forces had crushed the last remnants of Hitler's empire. When word reached the German people, there were no riots, no rallies, no final speeches. There was only silence and resignation. That night, across towns still smoldering from bombardment, people blew out their candles and whispered to each other that the war was over. In reality, the official surrender was still days away, but in the hearts of millions, it had already come. The last hope of the Wehrmacht was gone. The last command of Hitler's Germany had been reduced to static, and as dawn rose over the broken cities of the Reich, the first light fell upon a country that no longer existed. The jeeps moved on eastward, crossing rivers and valleys, carrying men who had seen the worst of humanity and had ended it. The silence. After the storm, when the guns finally stopped in May 1945, the sound that replaced them was not celebration, it was silence. Across Germany, a hush settled over the ruins. Cities that had once pulsed with parades and speeches were now graveyards of stone and dust. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years had lasted only 12. In that silence, the Americans became the new authority. They established military government headquarters in captured towns, issuing orders with precision and restraint. Roadblocks went up, weapons were confiscated, and soldiers patrolled intersections that just weeks before had been guarded by the Wehrmacht. The population, bewildered, hungry and disoriented, and obeyed. For the first time in years, Germans lived under rules not written by the Nazi Party. American MPs enforced curfews, banned Nazi insignia, and reopened roads for supply convoys. Loudspeakers declared, "This town is now under Allied occupation." The war had not only ended, it had reversed. In the markets of Cologne, Kassel, and Würzburg, Germans bartered cigarettes for bread, watches for canned meat. Starvation was everywhere. The winter of 1945-46 would become one of the hardest in living memory, not because of bombs, but because of emptiness. American relief convoys, sometimes the same units that had fought across the Rhine, now distributed food to the very civilians they had conquered. POWs were processed, camps were established, and in many cases German doctors worked side by side with American medics to treat civilians. For the soldiers, it was a strange transformation. Yesterday's enemy was today's dependent. The same men who had fought to destroy the Reich were now responsible for its survival. And yet, among many Germans, the sense of relief was undeniable. The nightmare of war was over. The SS patrols were gone. The fear of execution for a careless word had vanished overnight. In its place was fatigue, deep, physical, and spiritual. Across small towns, people began to rebuild in quiet ways. They salvaged bricks, patched roofs, and cleared rubble from streets. Children played again, though they did so among ruins. Women took in sewing, bartered for food, or searched for missing husbands and sons. Every village had its wall of absence, the handwritten lists of the dead, the missing, the displaced. Some families still waited for men who would never return from the East. Others found out their relatives had perished in camps they had never known existed. The American soldiers watched it all with a mix of pity and disbelief. For them, the mission was over, but the reality was only beginning. They had come to end tyranny. Now they faced the far greater task of rebuilding humanity. Still, discipline held. Despite exhaustion, most Allied troops followed strict orders. No revenge, no cruelty, no exploitation. A few exceptions occurred: looting, occasional violence. But in the vast mosaic of occupation, the tone was one of measured control. The Jeep, once the harbinger of conquest, now became the symbol of order, rolling through towns not to seize them but to ensure they functioned. Its presence meant food deliveries, medical patrols, law restored. In those first weeks, the German people began to associate that sound not with fear, but with survival. And in that quiet reversal lay the first seed of what would later become a nation rebuilt, not through ideology, but through humility, from occupation to understanding. The German surrender on May 8th 1945, VE Day, was both the end of the war and the beginning of a long awakening. For most civilians, the day passed quietly. There were no parades, no anthems, no speeches. Only the same gray streets, the same hunger, the same question whispered again and again. What now? The American occupation zones expanded rapidly. From Bavaria to Hesse and the Rhineland, the U.S. Army became the law, the government, and the only functioning institution. Under the Office of Military Government, OMGUS, administrators began the massive process of denazification, identifying who had supported the regime, who had obeyed, and who had resisted. Interrogations were carried out in schoolhouses and town halls. Teachers, mayors, police officers, all were questioned. Many who had been loyal to the party claimed ignorance. Some were believed, others were not. Yet even amid this purge, the Americans faced a moral puzzle. To rebuild Germany, they needed the same people who had once served the Reich. Engineers, doctors, and clerks were indispensable, and so pragmatism often outweighed punishment. The war had created no clear line between guilt and survival. Meanwhile, the camps were open to the world. Journalists, filmmakers, and Allied soldiers documented what they found. Piles of shoes, mass graves, faces staring blankly at liberation. The photographs were printed in newspapers across the globe. The German people were made to see them too. For many, it was the first time they confronted the full magnitude of the crimes committed in their name. Entire towns were marched through nearby camps under American orders. The goal was not revenge but recognition, to make denial impossible. In those grim processions, a new Germany was being born, one that could never again claim ignorance, and yet, the occupation was not only about judgment, it was about reconstruction. Within months, the Americans began restoring power plants, reopening schools, and printing new currency to stabilize the economy. They brought in food aid, rebuilt bridges, and trained local police. By 1946, the image of the American Jeep had transformed again, from invader to overseer to helper. Children waved at convoys that once terrified them. German mechanics worked alongside GIs repairing vehicles, often learning English in the process. There was still suffering, but there was also movement, a slow turning of the human spirit from despair toward survival. The Americans understood something profound. To win the peace, they had to give the defeated a future. And in doing so, they reshaped not only Germany, but the very idea of post-war justice. The civilians who once waited for the Wehrmacht now waited for food trucks, mail deliveries, and news of Reconstruction. The soldiers they had feared became the guarantors of order. Out of ruins came rules. Out of humiliation came understanding. And gradually, through rubble and ration cards, a truth began to take root, that the war had not only destroyed Germany's enemies, it had destroyed the very illusions upon which Germany had been built. The white flag still hung from windows, faded by rain and dust, but they no longer meant surrender. They meant endurance. The war was over. The rebuilding had begun. The sound of defeat, and the beginning of tomorrow in the end. It was not gunfire that defined Germany's final days. It was the sound of engines, steady, foreign, unrelenting. The people had waited for the Wehrmacht, for the gray uniforms that once embodied strength and order. But what arrived instead were American jeeps, painted with white stars, carrying men who spoke in unfamiliar tones yet carried themselves with quiet authority. That moment, when civilians stepped out from the ruins to meet the conquerors they had been taught to fear, was the true turning point of modern Germany. The war that began with marching, boots, and fanatic promises ended with rumbling tires and calm instructions. History had reversed itself. The nation that had once invaded others was now occupied. The people who had believed themselves chosen now faced the truth of being defeated, and for the first time free from their own delusion. The Jeep became more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of movement, of change, of the world rolling forward whether one was ready or not. Its engine marked the end of tyranny, but also the start of responsibility. Because with the fall of the Reich came not just ruin, but revelation. The lies had been burned away. What remained was the possibility, faint, fragile, yet undeniable, that a nation could rise again not through conquest, but through conscience. The Germans who waited for their army and met the Americans instead lived through one of history's most profound transitions. From darkness into daylight. From obedience into awareness. And as the jeeps disappeared into the horizon, their dust settling over broken stones and silent towns, they left behind more than occupation. They left the sound of a new beginning, quiet, steady, and real.